to meet up in person for the first time in a very long time. And then we're also sharing this online so that people can watch it at home as well. We have two very special guests this evening. Marcus Yam is a foreign correspondent who has been most recently based in Afghanistan, and we'll also be hearing from him in conversation with his editor, Jeffrey Fleishman, who is a former foreign correspondent himself. They'll be joining us in a minute, but first, I'd like to take you into Marcus's world in a video that we have put together with help from our partners at LA Times TV that'll take you to Kabul.
Hi, my name is Marcus Yam. I'm a photojournalist and a foreign correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. It's been an extraordinary couple of weeks since the Taliban has taken over this capital city of Kabul and the rest of Afghanistan.
Give me your phone. No, I'm not giving you my phone. You're the guys with the gun. What's the guy with the camera? All of you, guns. I am
The images that have stuck with me since the Taliban took over in the last 2 to 3 weeks are the images that portray a sense of loss and a sense of tragedy. On the morning of August 25th, we headed to Abbey Gate. Thousands of Afghans were trying to do the same.
They're firing shots. Streets are flooded. Cars are stuck in traffic. People are just crowded on the elevated sidewalks.
Taliban fighters pushing them back, holding them back, checkpoints after checkpoints. On August 26th, when the bombing happened, we made our way to two different hospitals. One was the Akbar Khan Hospital, and inside you can see more casualties, more bodies.
With his father.
Okay.
With his own father.
How many children is here?
3 sons, 3 daughters, 6.
Sorry, 6 kids.
We were embedded with a group of Taliban fighters on the northwest side of the airport. After the Americans had left, it's almost as though you're watching a fireworks show in the skies of Kabul. War in Afghanistan has always been an ongoing thing. This country has been war-torn for decades now. They've accepted that people are going to live short lives here. When I tell them I'm older than most of them, people are shocked. A lot of them don't expect to live past 40. These are everyday people like you and me, and I feel like, putting yourself in places beyond just an event or beyond just the news is the only way to make our readers care.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Donna, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thanks to Arizona State University. Well, as you saw, this wonderful work of Marcus began in mid-August. We knew that President Biden was going to withdraw American troops on the 31st of August, and we were planning to go there, but things, as you know, escalated so quickly, and what was known as Forever War was coming to a quick and dramatic end as the Taliban just continued to sweep across the country, and Afghan forces and the government capitulated, and there was just chaos as the country just began to downward spiral. So Marcus was in Beirut at the time, and we thought, he had a visa, thankfully, so we got him on a plane right away from Beirut to Doha, I think it was, and then into Kabul. So I want Marcus to sort of take you through the first 24 hours from packing up, leaving, and getting to Afghanistan as quickly as he could. So why don't you take us through that first day, basically?
I guess, okay. Hi, folks. We got off. I flew into Afghanistan on a commercial flight, a very normal way in, I guess, in light of the situation. And I think there were about like maybe a dozen or so souls on board this flight. And I was thinking to myself, like, well, here's a popular destination. And the first 24 hours was like any other 24 hours I've had in Afghanistan. I mean, everybody was talking about the government losing ground to the Taliban, and we hit the ground running. We went and reported on the displaced people, displaced persons coming from all the different provinces that the Taliban had taken over, and one of the things I remember thinking to myself, like, I think nobody realizes that the Taliban might come any day now. You know, everybody thinks there's still some time, and there's an expectation that government forces would make their last stand around Kabul.
Did they feel they were in a bubble, that they were in a protected zone, and the rest of the country would fall around them, but the capital wouldn't? Was that the?
I mean, that's the sense I got from the conversations I've had with people, and essentially everybody the few people I spoke to that were knowledgeable about this went to bed, you know, feeling safe that night. Probably. I mean, I remember after doing my reports, having a dinner with a friend and then going to bed. And then the next day, you know, essentially everything changed.
That's the funny thing about the business, right? You're there and your heart's racing. You have to get to a place. You have to make sure your checklist is all there, and then you can have a dinner at the end of it. But the next day and the next day weren't so. I mean, this tension level really picked up. So
right. I mean, I left Lebanon on the 13th of August. I arrived at the dawn of the 14th, basically, and worked all day. And then the Taliban circled Kabul on the 15th, basically. That's how quickly things evolved.
What was that sensation like being in the capital? We were watching it from the outside, and you just saw the places, the cities just falling one after the other, and the vice around Kabul really tightening. But what was it like inside at that time?
I mean, it was just the first day, on the 15th, it was just, it quickly became clear that it was just too chaotic. Nobody knew what was going on. And in the morning, it sounded like it was a rumor, and nobody could verify it. And then I remember calling my driver, we got to get to work. And I guess he, out of the fear of his life, he decided he couldn't work anymore, which was fine. And I released him, and I had to call a cab that day. It's like, hello, taxi, can I get a taxi to drive around Kabul and figure out the Taliban's coming? And it's funny, we sat in traffic. I remember with a colleague, a fellow journalist, we decided to buddy up and for safety reasons. And we sat in traffic for the most part that day. And everybody was going everywhere. Everybody was just trying to get home, basically. Nobody knew what was going on. Everybody wanted to get to their families. So the first 24 hours, when we heard that the Taliban were here, I thought maybe government forces would make a stand, just maybe. But then it seemed clear that none of that would happen.
Did you see any presence of government forces in the capital?
I did. I saw some government forces trying to clear traffic, and some of them were removing their uniforms. Most of them don't want their photos taken. Some of them, they knew they were going to abandon their jobs, basically. And later that evening, on the 15th, I remember getting up to the hill of Wazir Al-Bakan Hill, overlooking the American embassy. I just wanted to get a view of this embassy that had been cleared out already. And I met a soldier in this picture above, and he had been a soldier for more than a decade or so, and he told me how sad he was having to remove his uniform, you know, for good now, and he has to go back to one of his, you know, to one of the outer provinces, basically, and live a civilian life.
So, what are as the desperation begins to take hold of the city, what is it like as the Taliban are advancing, and what was the fall like?
I mean, using chaotic would be really be an understatement. It was like the first couple days were there were so many moving parts, you know, for the fall of Kabul, and the airport was one of the biggest news. Like people getting to the airport. I tried to go on my first day. I didn't bring the right equipment with me, and we were stuck in traffic, and there were gunshots at the airport already, and we had to turn around because the taxi driver didn't feel safe. So I went back the next day, and I found myself another driver to work with, who was willing to take me all the way up to the airport, basically. And he wouldn't leave his car, so basically we had a system in place where I wouldn't go past 200 meters out of his sight, basically. So we'd drive all the way up to the airport. He'll park right there. There's like tens of thousands of people, you know, milling around in front of the airport trying to get in. And there's just gunshots everywhere. And I'm trying to like record interviews basically and like ask questions and, you know, and
Are you able to focus at that point? I mean, do you have so much swirling around you? At that point, you're not only taking photos, but you're doing reporting for print, and you also had to have your wits about you. How did you keep that focus?
This is the thing about it. I love this job because it actually is the one thing I know how to do, and I do well. And I feel like once I hone in on doing my, like taking a picture or interviewing, I'm pretty laser focused. Like I feel like when I pick my camera up to take pictures, I'm hiding behind the camera, and I don't feel the adrenaline as much because I'm focusing on the frame, basically.
Do you feel detached or in the moment so much that it becomes organic almost?
It becomes organic. It's a combination of both. I mean, I feel detached when I'm taking a picture because I'm trying to like frame things, you know? I'm trying to see what the best picture is. So like things are happening in front of me, but then when I put the camera down, I feel more in the moment, basically, you know?
So as the capital is falling, as people are fleeing desperately to get out of the airport, as American troops are withdrawing, the C-130s are dropping in and out of the sky, there's just all of this pandemonium. Then we have an airstrike, a drone strike. And what you and Nabi, our Middle East bureau chief, were there. You were there hours after this strike. And take us through that, because that was a pivotal moment and a real bookend to America's involvement in Afghanistan.
I guess when we first heard of the strike, when we first heard of the strike, let me just skip over to the strike, because we had the airport bombing too before that.
Right.
So this is the strike. So when we first heard of the strike, we were actually at the airport trying to get access to the airport in preparation for the American withdrawal. And when we got there, it became clear that this wasn't a normal strike. This was a civilian home, and we were wondering what was going on. One of the many things that we did was I asked for a shovel, because once I got a better view of it from the top, I realized I could see where the missile had gone in and hit, and I started digging around looking for clues. And we found these parts, this right here, which are parts of a Hellfire missile, basically. And Nabi and I started getting to work. We spoke to as many people as possible. We found the family members there. This gentleman right here is one of the brothers of the deceased, and he was actually sitting in his room, his brother's room, crying. And we interviewed as many. Yeah, basically the gist of it is that we got to work, and we didn't stop working that day.
Yeah, and you and a few others on the scene basically confirmed within hours that it was in a U.S. drone, an American airstrike.
Yeah.
Let's go back a bit then to when the airport, because you and Nabi also accompanied when the Taliban actually took over the airport and the last American plane hit the night sky.
Oh, okay. That is, sorry, we're jumping around. When the Taliban basically came on the night of the 31st, that is, Nabi was instrumental in this. Nabi and I found an airport gate basically on the northwest side that the 01s had used, and not many people knew about it. And we spoke to the Taliban in charge of that gate basically, and essentially got permission to be there for when the last American plane leaves. And here you can see the 24 hours before the last American plane leaves, a Taliban fighter takes a picture of a C-130 leaving, which I thought was not possible 20 years ago, basically, like Taliban photography, mobile technology,
Mm-hmm.
and on the night itself, they charged in and we just ran after them. And it was quite a surreal moment. I mean, I never thought I would be here in this moment of American history, having, after the last plane leaving and watching like the very group that we've been fighting, our military has been fighting for years, just filling the void basically.
And they had on American-bought uniforms for the Afghan government. I mean, it seemed like it was just a weird changing of the guard, right?
Yeah, I mean, they were it was weird to me because from head to toe they were wearing American issue uniforms. They had Oakley glasses, they had mechanics gloves, they had like everything up to that, top to bottom. And I feel like the only thing that the only differentiator that made them stand apart was that they all wore sneakers. Most of them did at least. And they have a preference to like these like sneakers here, right? That guy right here.
That's sort of the Afghan style. Yeah,
it's very Afghan style. They love sneakers. I have no idea, like very 80s retro sneakers.
How did they treat you and Nabi? I mean, were you flies on the wall, or did they pay much attention to you? They obviously let you have access to it, but what was it like with them when they were entering the airport?
It was interesting because I tend to disappear into the background. Nabi tends to be the conversationalist. So the dynamic between the both of us, the working dynamic is great. I'll usually get Nabi to like talk to them, and I wander around basically. I think they didn't know what to do with us. They've never dealt with reporters. They've no idea. I mean, for them, it's just like, I think this is where vanity comes in. They've just like, oh, we're getting attention all of a sudden, before we were the enemy. So they were really intrigued that like all of a sudden we wanted to spend all this time with them, and take pictures of them, and they look, and in their heads, I'm thinking they probably think they look like heroes going in.
Right, that's what I was wondering, what the mood they must have had. I mean, to them, they're victors expelling a foreign power after 20 years of a country that they say is rightfully theirs.
Correct.
So they had a hero motif, I would think.
Yeah, I mean that's their. I guess that's the motif they have in their heads. I mean they were trying to tell us that too, and we just kept in mind. I don't interact on that level. I just be quiet and observe and ask them very specific questions. For the most part, yeah, they think they're heroes and they're liberating the country. So.
How about as a handover, and they become more and more ingrained and in power in the capital? What are those days like?
So in the early days, it was everything. There were no rules in the early days. We did most of the bulk of our work in the early days. We did a story about Taliban police. We went to the first Friday prayer. I remembered getting pulled aside with fellow journalists by a minder from this gentleman right here, Halil Haqqani, basically, and he told us to come with them. It's like, the Haqqani wants to see you, and we were like, okay. And I remember sitting in his room with him and looking him up, and I was like, oh, he has a bounty on his head. This is nuts. Yeah, he was. I'm in the same room with a known terrorist. This is crazy.
What was he like?
He seemed like a normal person, but I can't tell if he's a sociopath or if he's just like, really wanting to do something good for the country. I can't really tell because he spoke through a translator, so I didn't understand the gist of what he wanted, other than he was trying to convince us that everything is safe now. Mm-hmm. There's no need for like any more violence. He wanted to assure us that the Taliban was in control of security.
Yeah, I think that their mission was, at least in those early days, was to show that they weren't the Taliban of 20 years ago, and that they were slightly more evolved politically. So they allowed Western journalists, with the few that were there, to operate for a while. But and what was their presence like, though, around the city? I mean, were they putting security in force? I know they had some people patrolling the streets, but did you get the sense that they had a firm grip on it in those days?
Absolutely. I mean, they had, I guess they had what we called a curfew. They had checkpoints everywhere. Even in the first day since they took over on August 15th, I remember coming out of the place I was staying at, and there were literally every block had a Taliban fighter stationed on that intersection. Mm. Basically, they were watching everybody. They wanted to start collect information on everybody.
And a lot of these guys were from the provinces, right? I mean, they had been fighting the Americans in the hinterlands for a long time, and here they come to the capital. Mm-hmm. I bet a lot of them probably had never been to Kabul before. So, but tell us what happened when you covered the protest and with the people protesting against the Taliban.
So I'll answer the first part, is that, yeah, I mean, a lot of them came from the provinces, a lot of them lived out in the countryside. So, I mean, we tried to talk to them and ask them how they felt about big city life. And it's funny because they generally don't like big cities. They deplore sitting in traffic. Like, this is the number one concern. Like, like they always like, traffic sucks.
Some things are universal, no matter your
exactly.
persuasions, yeah.
Yeah, and I joke with them like, why don't you fix traffic? This is the number one problem, right? Fix traffic, win hearts and minds, basically. But when the women protests started springing up, it became a clear problem because I don't think they understood or knew how to deal with crowd control. I mean, that's what they told us, at least, that they don't have the expertise to deal with crowd control, and it's the cause for all the violence, in these protests. But really, I just don't think they wanted it in the media. That's it. And on the day of the protest, Nabi and I were pulled aside basically at PD3, one of the police stations, and they wanted to detain us and all that stuff. And I remember arguing with them and like, no, we're just doing our jobs. There's no reason to detain us. They wanted me to delete my footage, and then we really just argued back. And essentially, I remember that afternoon, one of the Taliban fighters like threatening to, do some harm to me, and I just, kind of argued back like, well, I'm unarmed, like, you can't hurt an unarmed civilian, and because now you're the government, you're in charge, you're the men with all.
So you're giving them a civics lesson.
Exactly. Essentially, yeah. I mean, like in that opening video, you heard me arguing back with them. Nabi and I basically was just, and one of the Taliban fighter wanted to move to hit me, and he raised his arm, and I saw his commander stop him. He's like, "This is a foreigner, do not touch them," which leads to the next thing, because in that same police station that day were a bunch of people that were beaten up and tortured, including 2 journalists, basically, and we found out about it. And then within hours of their release, we went and interviewed them and got their side of the story. And it was pretty grim. I mean, they were essentially tortured. They were put to the ground, they were beat, they were whipped, one even mocked. These 2 were videographers, and one of the Taliban fighters mocked them. Are you still filming us? Which to me indicates the fact that even though the Taliban had promised the international community, free press, to uphold women's rights and all that stuff, that this was a clear sign of things to come.
And you had also, you had a physical run-in with them earlier, when you were. One of the worst things I think a foreign editor can get is when I called Marcus and I said, how are you doing, one day, and he said, everything's good. I got beat up by the Taliban.
I mean, it's not something I expected to have happened to me, but I was out covering the Independence Day, and I think a protest started brewing up, and you could see all these people showing up with the Afghan flags, and the Taliban, wanted people to wave the white flag instead of the Afghan flag because they were changing the country's name to the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, not the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And out of nowhere, I was with another photographer. We had moved around the protest to avoid a direct line of like where the rifles were pointing. So we moved to the side, and I was starting to take pictures. And it was clear that they were going to beat up the protesters. They were pointing guns at the protesters, and out of nowhere, a Taliban fighter came out and just sucker punched me from the side. Basically, I didn't see him coming, and he was a big, burly guy, and he just knocked me down and told me to stop taking pictures, told me to delete my images, and I mean, I think that's what he's telling me. He's speaking in a language I don't understand, and when I told him I'm pressed, he kept pummeling me, basically, and to the point where, like, I think I almost lost my glasses if it weren't for my friend who picked it up for me, but anyways, it was a very terrifying experience, I would say. But it's more, I always remind myself, no matter what happens to me, it doesn't compare, because we're foreigners in this country. We have a certain degree of privilege and protection compared to the local Afghans.
And then but as I remember, that incident also de-escalated in a rather comical way, right? When they brought you energy drinks or something?
So what had happened was that another Taliban fighter had come up. He spoke English, and he actually had been the other Taliban fighter that assaulted the other journalist, and he came up to me, and they came up to us and asked who we worked for, and we said who we worked for, and he went, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," and he runs off, and he comes back with cold water and Monster energy drinks, and I'm thinking to myself, this is surreal.
Which leads to how in that environment, I mean, how did you navigate it? How did you get us around? How did you get around? Give us a little bit of insight on what it's like working in those conditions day after day after day.
I guess on a day-to-day basis, I mean, first of all, it's not a vacation. I mean, like, Nabi and I, we pull long days. Some days we work 18 hours, up to 18 hours a day or more, and because we also stay past our bedtime to work in the time zone that you guys are on, basically, right? And we have to communicate with you guys. We oftentimes stay up till 3 in the morning, just to finish our stuff, or 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning, and then we wake up at like 7 or 8 and run back out the door, basically. So it's quite a, what's the word? It's quite a chore, just to like go through that day after day after day after day without like taking any days off.
How about the immersion part of it, though, when you're trying to disentangle, to figure out what's going on? I mean, you knew what was going on. The Taliban came in, but there were so many fearful people in the streets, people still trying to leave. What was it like trying to get to those stories and make some sense out of them?
What was it like? I mean, essentially, you have to keep in mind that this is not just about a country falling apart. This is about a generation of people that grew up living a free life. I mean, a lot of people we spoke to had not known the life before all this. A lot of young people we spoke to, even last year when we made a trip out there, were only as old as the war. So we keep in mind that, like, it's about their lives upended. Nabi and I talked about it extensively when we were there, and we have philosophical discussions about what we should cover and what we should not cover. But essentially, we wanted to do stories that carry universal meanings. Stories that made our readers care, not so much of the politics of, like, a story. We didn't want to do stories that only like, you know, the region would care about. You know, we wanted our readers to care, and the only way to do that is to find stories that really stuck out to us.
Did they feel, especially the younger ones who had only grown up under American occupation and a large degree of freedom comparatively to people in the rural lands, but was there a sense of abandonment?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I from gathering from my conversation with so many people, a lot of people felt upset by the whole situation. I mean, the people that grew up in Kabul and lived in Kabul definitely felt it a lot more than the people in the rural provinces. I mean, from our reporting trip, it seemed like the people in the rural provinces, you know, the non-ethnic minority people, like the majority, ethnic majority folks, felt more satisfied that America's left because the war was over for them. There was no more fighting in their province, basically. And we visited Logar province and sorry, let me backtrack a bit. We visited the different provinces, and the sense we got is that people were just glad there were no more fighting, that people weren't getting killed anymore, homes weren't getting destroyed. You know, it was just a very rinse, repeat, wash situation for them when fighting was going on. They always had to rebuild their homes. They always had to go bury a relative, and they worried about that. And now, with the Americans gone and the Taliban promising security, there was none of that left.
I think what also helped inform both you and Nabi during the fall was actually when you were there months earlier, and you spent a lot of time there with different facets of life. And so, how do you think that reporting trip helped inform you to what was going to come months later? You covered I think the musicians. You were with the Afghan military, the Air Force. What was that like? Learning you were in Kandahar, you know, learning more and more about the country.
So I'm gonna skip to this one. We were there even last year. I went there with another reporter, David Cloud, too, and I think one of the things we learned was that like they weren't ready to stand on their own. I mean, it felt like when we were in Kandahar, everybody we spoke to repeated the same thing: Kandahar is going to fall. Like there's no way they could defend Kandahar. Kandahar is the spiritual home of the Taliban, you know, and I don't think people were going to resist them there very much, and they were losing so much ground even like months before the fall. And yeah, I mean, so we knew that was going to happen, and people sensed that too. So we knew that if Kandahar falls, Kabul's next, right, basically.
But that really gives the sense of what you just described. Really give the sense of the inevitability that a lot of Afghans, despite 20 years of an American-backed government, although they kept failing in a lot of ways, but it just seemed like it was this movement toward things that everyone thought was going to happen. Eventually the Taliban will take control of the country. So the Afghans really had no faith in their government was corrupt, and it sounds like from what you're saying, they just thought the inevitable was going to happen. The Taliban will take control of Kandahar and the rest of the country.
Right, and even when we were doing the story about the Air Force, I mean, it became clear. Sorry, that was a little jarring, but I apologize. It became clear to us that even while we did that story, they couldn't hold their own ground because they required contractors, U.S. contractors, to even buy bullets for them, you know, to fix their helicopters, to repair everything. They couldn't do it themselves. They even after 20 years and countless of dollars poured into this program, program that that our government hailed as successful, they couldn't fix their helicopters without us. They couldn't buy bullets, so it was alarming, when we were there to think about it, and it was like, oh, I guess if the U.S. pulls out, who's going to support the Afghan Air Force?
Mm-hmm. And what the pilots were pretty open with you guys, as I recall too. I mean, they really let you into their lives.
Yeah, I mean, they were really open. They were friendly. I mean, this was one of the stories where I felt like when we first thought of it, we didn't go through the usual channels, and which is contact the Ministry of Defense, ask for permission, and not so much that. We tried that, but we ended up just pulling up to their airbase in Kandahar, and Nabi being Nabi, just knocked on their door and charmed them, basically. And within a couple hours, we were on a helicopter flight out to the reservoir, basically a resupply mission, basically.
So you saw that side of it, and then you saw, what other things did you see on that trip?
We saw a lot of things. I mean, we saw a resupply mission. We saw like soldiers we saw freshly rested soldiers heading out into the battlefield, and we saw soldiers, who were injured coming back. I mean, who were battle weary. They couldn't even they didn't have what was apparent to me during the war before the Taliban took over was that they lacked logistical infrastructure to resupply. They could not figure out how to resupply their outposts, and they relied on the Air Force, to even bring them food. And something as basic as food and not having access to that is mind-blowing. So it became clear there were a lot of things wrong with the whole process.
But then in the one story you guys did on the musicians, I mean, there was a sense of beauty in this horror that was to come. I mean, the musicians trying to hang on to their legacy, trying to hang on to the music of their past and what made them,
Yeah. So I first of all, for context, music is when the Taliban first took over 20 years ago. I mean, they banned music, right? They destroyed instruments. They were notoriously known for this. So when the Taliban when the idea that the Taliban would one day come back and take over, we did a story about these rubab players. Basically, we found a building, somewhere in a place called Shore Bazaar that was full of musicians that played at weddings, basically. And in there, we spoke to all these musicians. And Nabi, being a musician himself, Nabi Bulus, the Middle East bureau chief, was a concert violinist. Mm-hmm. So he was particularly attached to this story, and he really charmed all the musicians. So I have to give him credit for this story. He really took the story to the next level.
What's it? You mentioned, what's it like? I think a lot of us would like to know what it's like collaborating with another person, like you and Nabi working together. Correspondents do it all the time. But what kind of relationship? You mentioned philosophical discussions, things about coverage, how you approach things. How did your relationship with him evolve?
So Nabi and I only started working together we've been only working together for about a year now, not more than that.
But it's been in intense places.
Yes, we've been into very, very intense places, and I would say that we just clicked immediately. We are like the yin and yang, right? I mean, it's Nabi is rambunctious, he's energetic, he's go-getter, and I'm methodical. I'm I analyze a lot, and I just I usually stay very, very quiet and calm, and so the both of us together are actually a good pair, in my opinion. And as having worked with the both of us and on being on calls with us, you'll ask him one thing and then you'll ask me another thing.
Right. Yeah.
You never ask us the same things, basically.
And you work things out too, right? About how you approach a story and what the story should say. You mentioned universal meanings and things that resonate beyond the geography of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, Nabi would call me the cheese ball of the story. I tend to want to find sentimental meaning to things. I'm a photographer, I can't help it. And Nabi wants to get to
the core of the story immediately, you know, the news hook and all that stuff. And I'm just like, no, but what about the poor person here, you know? So he always would make fun of me, but eventually, like, we'll meet somewhere halfway, you know, for most of our stories together.
How did you? I mean, you didn't grow up with the ambition to be a photojournalist or a foreign correspondent. How did you arrive at this point?
So, long story. I'm going to condense it as fast as possible. I was born and raised in Malaysia. I went to college in Buffalo, New York for aerospace engineering, and I fell into photography by accident because I needed English credits to graduate, and I worked for the college paper out of sheer laziness instead of taking English classes. And a photo editor at the Buffalo News discovered the work that I did for the college paper, and basically called me up one day and we had a 45-minute conversation, and he asked me, what do you want to do with your life, you know, and all that stuff. And he basically told me, I think you should be a photographer. Have you thought about that? And he gave me an internship and to try out. And I think that changed my life overnight, basically.
Like that? I mean, you felt it like this was your
I felt like that 3 weeks into the internship. Not immediately, but 3 weeks in, after I realized what a special job this was.
Why? What made it special? What made it click like that?
I think it was a time of my life, and I think most people finishing college will realize this too, when you just understand a little bit more about yourself. And I realized I wasn't made to sit behind a desk 9 to 5 as an engineer, and I'd found a job that let me kind of explore life, you know. But it's very exciting, you know. I had permission to walk into people's homes. I got to see how people live, you know. Permission to do anything, basically go anywhere, take pictures. Like, it was not going to get any more exciting than that in my head, at least at that point in my life.
The two things, and we skipped over one, and I'd like to go back to it, because the two, before we get to the last piece, we did Women in Hiding over the weekend, but the one story that stuck out to me too was when, and if you could play that the video of the funeral, and what the cost of when America or any country goes into a foreign land, the legacy they leave behind, even as they're on their way out the door, and the human impact that's often missed in the headlines, and the suffering or the joy sometimes, but in this case the suffering of a family burying its family killed by a drone strike.
So it was a very tough coverage for us because so many things happened so quickly. The day the American withdrew was the same day we went out to check out the drone strike too. And I remember drone strike site in the morning, filed the story, went to the funeral, filed, went to the airport, you know, saw the Taliban charged in that night, filed. Like, we never slept that day. Like, it was just a lot. And I think one of the moving things for me covering that story was that the family was so open to letting us, like, you know, being so close to them. I mean, in the West, when we have something tragic, the media is usually never that upfront and center to things, you know, to grief, basically. And I think in this, I mean, I wish I can skip forward. In this, sorry, we really skipped like around here. I apologize, guys. Here we go. And one of the more poignant moments for me happened at the funeral of this coverage, when I remember being on my knees. Note to anybody who wants to be a journalist, we're on our knees a lot, so, you know, wear knee pads. I was on my knees, and the funeral was about, like, on the hillside facing the airport. and F-18s were flying around, circling the airport for protection. And at one point, one of the F-18s flew a lot more lower than it usually did, and basically disrupting, the grieving process. And I remember seeing the whole family just like look up in this moment, and it was quite a moving moment for me, because it was just like rubbing salt into the wound for them.
Yeah. Did they? You did make a connection with them, especially the brother. I mean, you went back to him later, and the brother of the father who was killed.
Yeah. So on my way out of Afghanistan, I wanted to say goodbye to the family. I wanted to thank them. So I made a trip all the way to their neighborhood, and I touched base with Imal, and I said to him, thank you so much for opening up to us. Thank you for sharing your story. I'm leaving Afghanistan tomorrow. And that's when he basically reached out to me. That's where he told me, like, well, I haven't gotten a call from the American government. I don't think I'm we're not getting reparations. We haven't gotten they apologized on TV, but nobody contacted them at that point,
And how many family members were killed? Were 11 or 10 or 11?
10 family members.
Mhm.
7 of them were children, which made it very, very hard, basically, during this coverage. Yeah, I mean, that funeral was very hard, because I saw a lot of the coffins. They were like, 3/4 the size of a full coffin or less, basically. And yeah, I mean, it was a tough situation for that family.
And the other thing that you really focused on, I was often telling Marcus it was time to get out. We were worried about his safety, but he wanted to keep pressing and staying there until he got to this story of he told the story of a newspaper that was trying to struggle and tell its truth, and you saw the stories of the beaten journalists. But the one he was really focused on was on telling the story of Afghan women and what they were going to endure, because everybody knew when the Taliban took over, the women issue was going to be front and center, and where the country went from there was going to be how it treated its women. And Marcus was just like intense. I'd say, okay, well, it's time to go. No, I've got another interview with a woman to do. It's time to go. No, I've got another one. And it went from, he said, okay, I'll just do 1 more. Then it was 2 more. Then it was 3 more. Then I think it was 13. And then we said, Marcus, it's time to go. So you finally did, but I think the end result of what ran in the paper and last week was really an amazing piece of work. So if you could talk about that and share that.
First of all, it was 17 women.
17. Sorry. See, I lost count after 13.
So
I just blocked it out.
I just found a way to prolong my trip here. So we found 17, more than a dozen courageous women who agreed to speak with us, to share their stories with us. I mean, it was I think one of the things that resonated with me, the thing we talked about, me and Nabi talked about, is finding stories that carry universal meaning. Was it made me think about all the people that couldn't make it on those flights. I mean, the U.S. government proudly announced they had evacuated more than 120,000 people. I'm not entirely sure of that number, but and I thought to myself, after they had withdrawn, so many people came up to me and said, well, I have an SIV, I have this, I have that, I'm at risk. And I realized so many people that were supposed to be on those flights didn't make it on those flights, and then there were and also on top of that, because the Taliban had also cut off school for girls, the issue of education for women became clear front and center. And I thought to myself, we need to do something on the women that are left behind, the women that stayed behind. So I embarked on this project. I spoke to you about it, and I guess the biggest challenge for me at that point was finding these women, because they were mostly in hiding. They were not easy to track down, especially the ones that were at risk. This woman right here was a former police officer that was injured on the line of duty, and she had scars, burn scars visible, like 2/3 of her body. Basically, I couldn't even show reveal any of her skin because she would be very visible, and she basically is on the run. She breaks her SIM cards, change phones, change numbers. She burned all her documents. She burned her uniform. All she wants is to be a police officer again.
But she was forced to give up her identity, it sounds like, at least to the outside world.
Exactly. And I met like other women who, like this lady here, who's a journalist in a rural central province, and couldn't do her job anymore, essentially, because journalism is at this point, journalists are at risk, and being a female journalist is like a double whammy for her. And so we interviewed so many people, including Mahbouba Siraj, a very famous women's rights activist, and here, walk me through this. We profiled a university dean, a teacher,
policewoman,
business owner, a 21-year-old business owner, a cafe proprietress. The 21-year-old business owner was interesting. Her name was Sakina, and at 21, she started her own business with just $12. She started an interesting like Bookshare library space that was so popular, and her father didn't even believe that she could do it. Her father dissuaded her from doing it, even beat her at one point to stop her from doing it, and she just did it anyways. And before the Taliban took over, it was a very successful business.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with her, that the thing that stuck with me the most was that after doing the interview, I returned back to her to visit her again to see how they were doing, and she pulled me aside and said, "Mr. Marcus, I have something important to discuss with you." And I was like, "What's going on?" And she tells me that she has an opportunity to leave the country now, that she had gotten a job offer with a former classmate of hers in Turkey at an IT company. But it's like, oh, that's great. I mean, go do it. Go leave the country now. And it was a job offer for her and her business partner, Fatima, who's not in the story, unfortunately. But here's the caveat, she says. "I need your advice," she says. "He's asking me to marry him or else I don't get this job." And I'm just like, oh God, I can't advise you on this one. I mean, what does your heart tell you? And she started tearing up, and we talked about it for a while, and she's left with this like dilemma, this conundrum. I mean, like, it's very difficult, like, do go with freedom or stay true to herself.
Mm-hmm. Well, that the other thing, the other dilemma I see you faced, and as we go through these photos, you can see, is you had to bring these women to life, but at the same time protect their identity. As a photographer, just tell us a little bit about that approach of how you bring out a personality, but yet not fully reveal them, but yet they are fully revealed in their obscurity in some of these cases.
It's a tough challenge for a photographer to make a portrait and get the essence of a person without showing their face. And I think for me, the thing that worked for this project was that I spent a lot of time with these women. Some of them I returned back to them for the second time just to like check on them to see how they're doing. I keep in touch with them on messaging apps just to like, how are you doing? Are you safe? Most of our interviews go for like 2-3 hours basically. Where it's 1 hour's interview, 2-3 hours just chit chat. Just like exchanging life stories basically, because I don't just want to see them as people for the story. I just want to also know who they really are. And a lot of the reporting from our chit chats made it into the story basically, because the interview itself is so formal. You ask these very set questions, but once you get to know them, ask them about their families and how they grow up, you really get a sense of who they are.
You get the sense that after all that time, they really did open up to you.
Yeah.
I mean, at person to person.
Yeah, I thought so. I mean, it was one of those stories where I felt like I've never gotten to say this, but it's really corny, but I got a lot of people to cry on this story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very upsetting. I mean, I'm happy. I heard back from most of them after the story published, and half of them, more than half of them, are now in a safe space. Basically, they've gotten out of the country now, and are very pleased that their stories have gotten out, and essentially it captures their soul.
Mm-hmm.
One of them told me, at least.
Wow. Well, my final question is, in such an, how would you say that this one journey, this one trip, we all have these moments in our life where it just changes or something stays with us, and I'm not saying your life changed, but what moment, or is there any singular thing that you took away from this last trip to Afghanistan that you'll know will stay with you forever? As far as, is it an image? Is it a conversation? Is it the totality, the mosaic of everything that is just there, or is there one strand that you say, this sort of defines it for me, this trip?
I don't think there's one particular moment for me with Afghanistan. I have made repeat trips to Afghanistan since 2017, and I remember going on that first trip with Shashank Bengali, and I remember thinking to myself, there's something about this country that's fascinating, and I keep going back to it. And I think it's the people I meet there, the stories we do there. It's just also the fact that it's a remnant of American influence that is very fascinating to me. That this is the country that we built up. This version of Afghanistan is the country we built up. We gave them freedom of speech. We've given them education. We built up this country. We were nation building, basically. And that part was interesting to me, but also the people and the culture were so fascinating. They were so kind. They were so hospitable. I made some lasting friendships there, and that's why I keep going back to it. And I think it's probably the mosaic of everything together that has led to this one moment where I thought, when the Taliban circled Kabul, I thought to myself, well, I'm glad this is not my first trip to Afghanistan.
All right. Well, you're going back probably in another month or so. Before the end of the year, anyway. So, okay. Well, Donna, do you have some questions from our readers in the audience?
We do. Well, first of all, thank you both. Please join me in thanking our guests. That was really amazing. And the photos, while Marcus was talking, he was sharing his photos simultaneously, which was just incredible. So thank you both.
Thank you. I apologize for jumping around in photos. I hope that's okay.
We had quite a few questions from our audience, and some of them you covered. Some of them I tried to pull out a few that came up over and over again. You talked about your transition into photography, and that's something people were curious about, is how you got to do what you do. But the question that you didn't really address from that was, are your parents and family supportive of your career change when you decided you're not going to be an engineer anymore and you're going to go be a photographer around the world? How did that play at home?
Not great. My parents wanted me to be a doctor or lawyer, and not so much a photographer and all that. So I think that when I went the engineering path, it was probably the middle ground for them at first, and then and after I graduated and flipped careers afterwards, it was just like, it was a very tough decision to make, basically, to go against the grain and do it. But I feel like it was something that was worth doing, and I feel like I practiced that decision-making skill even in my job today. Always go against the grain, just find something else, don't take the easy way out.
There was another related question. As you chose such a risky occupation, have you convinced your family that it was the right path, or do they still think you're nuts?
I'm pretty sure they still think I'm nuts. Yeah. I don't think you will be able to convince any family that it's the right path, especially when there's risk involved, Everybody's always going to be concerned for you, even your friends. So.
Another audience member wanted to ask more about the Afghan women in your most recent series and wondered, how did you find those women and how did you get them to tell their stories?
Logistically, it was very, very challenging. Usually we work with, journalists work with fixers, people who facilitate a story, people who have connections to the community. In this situation, most of the translators, drivers, and fixers in Afghanistan have all fled the country. So hence why I was using a taxi a lot until I met a driver named Zabibullah who had worked with photographers and helped me drive, move around the city. But we didn't have a fixer for this story, and I think I relied on the goodwill of people that I had met and kept in touch with to open doors for me. I made the pitch to a lady named Laila Haidari, who was an owner of a very famous cafe called Taj Begum, and she was in touch with a lot of very interesting and prominent women that and I basically made a story pitch to her, like, I want to do this story, can you help me find people? And a lot of them are hard to track down, like that police woman was hard to track down. In fact, the only reason why I found her was because I met another journalist who was in a chat group with a lot of women activists, and she had just joined that chat group that week or something, and we were able to track her down. We went to a very isolated, very rural neighborhood out on the outskirts of Kabul, where there were no vehicles, and I remember I only had 45 minutes to interview and photograph her because it was a security risk to be out in that neighborhood with a car. Neighbors would look and realize there was a foreigner in that home, and that would put her at risk, basically. So I had the taxi waiting for me, engines running, like, be ready, we're gonna run. And we did as much as we can, as quickly as we can. And that was probably the shortest interview I did for that story. And the way we talked to them, I don't have a process to getting people to open up, but like one of the women in that story was a publisher for a feminist magazine called Nimrok Media, and I had not gone through any channels to find her. I had met her by accident in a cafe. I sat there to drink coffee to wake myself up, and I noticed this woman who had her headscarf down and was like, had her hair revealed, which in Afghanistan is usually like, the men require all women to have, there's this expectation that they have to cover their hair, the religion requires it. So I realized, oh, something's off, and she looks a little upset. So I figured out a way to talk to her. I waited there at the cafe for 2-3 hours trying to figure out how to talk to her, and then I finally did, and learned of her story. And I asked her, can I please interview you for the story? And then we decided on the time and place the next day in a safe house somewhere. And interestingly enough, when I met her the next day and met her and did the story, the driver that I worked with was parked far enough away to keep an eye out on the house, and had picked out a Taliban fighter pretending to pick up trash, basically, and snooping around the house we were in. And it's when he texted me, he's like, get out, time to move on. So yeah, there were a lot of moments like that in this story where I felt like I'm very, very fortunate, and we're very, very fortunate that these women risked a lot to come forward with their life stories.
This leads us to the next question. Is it possible for you to pick out what was the most memorable personal story that you've heard in Kabul?
Is it possible?
Can you? Do you have
it's hard. I mean, everybody's story from there is so incredibly powerful and so memorable. I can't quite pick. I mean, I'm gonna say no. I mean, it's hard for me to pick one out. I mean, everybody's got an incredibly sad story coming out of there, I think in situations like that, it's you feel honored to be telling. You feel honored to be telling the story of someone who doesn't have a voice outside of the realm that they find themselves in. And I feel like many times that when you're allowed to give voice to that,
you just feel this connection to this person and almost a debt to it that you have to do as much as you can, as well as you can, to articulate exactly what that person is feeling, because he or she may be on the verge of losing everything, and their life may just vanish as they know it. And I think the women's story showed that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Once you've made that exchange, that connection, you feel like you are at their service now. You're definitely indebted to them. You owe them the quality of your work, basically, and you can't let them down with the work that you do.
Right.
So there is that part. That part I think is the most memorable part for me, because I feel like everybody that I met, reported on, have left me with that feeling that I can't drop the ball. We can't drop the ball as an organization on this.
We had quite a few questions from students who basically would like to know, how do they get to be you? But I'm going to give you some of the specifics, and I'd like to put this to Jeff as well. The questions were one student who is waiting for information for firming up a summer internship and wanted to do some of the suggestions for some of the things to do to get ready for a career in journalism, questions about a career in photography. You're in a very specialized field as the foreign and national editor, and Jeff is also a former foreign correspondent, arts writer, has done it all. You've done things. So basically, to sum up these questions is, what do you suggest for someone who would like to get into this field? So maybe I'll start with Marcus, and then we'll ask Jeff to talk about what at this moment do you both suggest for preparing for this field as a foreign correspondent?
Talk to Jeff. No, I'm just kidding. I would say, I don't know. I mean, I had zigzagged my way to this job, and having a degree in engineering, I think, has helped me in this job, because I was trained to think analytically, and I think that's one of my biggest strengths coming to this job. And I think sometimes you don't necessarily have to do journalism, study journalism to do this job. You can study political science, you can study math, you can study other things too. So I think the best way to go about it is to try everything until it sticks. I mean, the industry itself has been upended by the digital technology, and the way forward for young journalists is not clear. And I think it was not clear even when I started out a decade ago. And I think we just have to try everything and keep in touch with people and play to your strengths, basically, and try not to emulate other people. Just listen to your own voice as a journalist, and that's how you really succeed.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the main thing for any journalist, and particularly for one maybe starting out, especially if you want to go overseas, but it is to surprise people. So many people think they understand a place or a region, or they think they understand it because of headlines and what they've seen. But our job as foreign correspondents is to go to a place, create a world that you as the reader or the viewer can step into and feel your way around it. So you feel like you don't just know the outlines of something, but you intimately understand the suffering or the joy or just the everyday life of people in the world. And I think if you can approach that and go down the path that other people aren't taking, the best stories I've always found in my career are the times when I got lost, because I didn't have an agenda, I didn't know where I would end up. And then so many times, I think that's what's so great about the business, is that you'll be surprised. Somebody will surprise you at some road in some country, and you'll understand a little bit more about yourself, about the world, and how to make other people care about the world. So I think if you have that in your heart, then I think you can succeed in this.
Yeah, I think, and also caring for people, just being human is the recipe for being a good journalist, right? The reason why I felt like the reporting for the women's story got better, it was because I just wanted to check up on some of the folks. And from the second trip, found more reporting material, basically, because they were opening up to me even more, basically. And that wasn't my intention. My intention was just to say hi and have tea, you know. And
Well, I think anyone seeing all your photos and your terrific work, it's what is the one thing that comes out? It's compassion. It's every image is a human rendering of a moment of compassion, despite the horror that a lot of it came out of. And I think that's essential to doing what we do.
Yep.
And this will be our final question. What were your thoughts as you were heading out of the country on the very last flight from Kabul?
I was my very last. So this is very tough because like we were sitting on the runway, and there was news of an explosion that just happened, and I was actually thinking, I don't want to go. I can want to stay. I was like thinking maybe I should get them to open the plane door and I could just rush back out. But I felt bitter. It felt bittersweet to leave. I mean, we had been there for almost 8 weeks in country, but also I knew that if I left, I could finish producing the story, and we, could do a lot more, and I could get, we could recharge, resupply, and come back with a greater sense of purpose, basically. But yeah, it was very, very bittersweet to leave.
Mine when he left was ultimate relief.
Dean Batts from the journalism school was supposed to join us this evening, and his plane got delayed, and so he was unable to be up here on stage tonight. And what he was going to talk about was about ASU's new California Center here in this historic journalism building, the former home of the Herald Examiner, and the plans for ASU's new journalism program. So I'm hoping that this is the first of many partnerships with this new school that we do. And I want to thank the entire ASU team for putting this together. They haven't really done any events. This space is so brand new. They've been literally taking the equipment out of the boxes over the last few weeks, and today putting it together. So we all were so pleased to work with them, both the tech staff, the administrative staff, and the whole team here. So I just want to thank everyone at ASU for hosting us and welcoming us as partners. And I hope we'll hear from Dean Batts at a future event. He's with the journalism school as they're expanding here in LA. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. As I said, we've just been tiptoeing back into in-person events, and we'll be doing a lot more. So we always send everyone a survey after every one of whether it's our book club, our ideas exchange, ask a reporter, we can teach you that. We have all kinds of events that we do. So once you come to one of our events, we always send you a survey, because we genuinely want to hear what did we get right, what should we do next time, what could we do better, what will you take away from this evening. So I hope you'll take a minute to tell us, because we hope to see you all again. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to our amazing guests. This was just extraordinary. Thank you, Jeff and Marcus.
Thank you.
And on something like this, I always like to give our guests the very last word. Jeff, what's your last word what would you like to leave our audience with this evening?
Drive safely.
Okay. Marcus, how about you? Any final thoughts?
Support local news.
Yes. Great. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
He's here.
I saw the picture. The picture was 10 times better.
That's okay.